Every area in all parts of the world have those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts a lonely stretch of road outside of town, there is always a common thread within these tales. No one has ever been to these places, have seen any of the creatures, or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who will proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went through a haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood, snakes, and spiders, and that it was so scary no one has ever made it all the way through. Those are the same people that will swear by these stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or a name of someone who can provide proof to the claim simply because everyone around here knows it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales on to their children, who modify them to keep up with the changing times, and the cycle continues. I am just as skeptical as anyone when it comes to these stories, seeing how I was like a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for more terrifying stories about whatever area of the country I was living in at the time. I made up and spread stories about haunted pizza parlors in New York, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral human-like creature in the woods of Colorado. I even broke one rule of these stories by putting myself in them. This took guts in hindsight because I had to make sure I always told the story the same way, and surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff. I like to think I had some wonderful contributions to the various legends around the Midwest and Northeastern states. I moved around a lot. There would always be a surge of joy whenever I would wander the halls of school and hear one of my classmates retelling the stories to another one of their friends, adding little bits here and there like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, the stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground whenever someone asked me about them. I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking in a shaky voice or looking scared when I would recount a situation that I had supposedly experienced myself. I suppose this aspect of my childhood has led to my current predicament, which I will recount in full for the internet to take from it what they will. I have laid this little introduction out as a sort of disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who will call my story into question. I have been like the boy who has cried wolf for years, and I reassure you with every ounce of honesty and integrity I have left in me at this time, the wolf is real. From my introduction, it's probably apparent that I have moved around the country quite a bit in my middle and high school years. Neither of my parents had anything to do with any branch of the armed forces. They simply didn't tend to hang around any given spot for too long. I suppose it had some kind of effect on me, but I wasn't hurt by it or anything like that. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily. I was often called the class clown, and because of that, I was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time next semester rolled around. My friendships were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships I would ever have with my teachers. Because of the events that followed, my memory of one teacher in particular is probably slightly skewed, but I will attempt to give my least biased version of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of my social study teachers in the early years of my high school experience. Being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age, and I respect him to no ends for the way that he connected with us. He seemed like us, he talked like us, made pop cultural references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn when he was giving a passionate lecture about the Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore, even a little bit, was the epitome of cool to a freshman in high school. My memories of Mr. Mays mostly stem from the way he got really into anything he was doing. The instance that is still very vivid in my mind was, of course, around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays had the typical teacher decorations around the classroom, a smiling jack-o'-lantern and black cat cartoons, typical and boring in the minds of an egotistical high school student. However, on the 31st of October, when most of the teachers were rolling their eyes at the fact teenagers still took dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to the next level. We walked into the classroom and were surprised to find the blinds were drawn, sheets over the smaller windows, candles lighting the room, and a single frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting on a stool in front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk, just watching the students come into the class to take their seats. He didn't have to ask anyone to be quiet because the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood and took a seat on a chair right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room.
Today is probably my favorite day of the year, class. Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much.
One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on her face.
I'm pushing the due date for your papers to next Tuesday,
said Mr. Mays without bothering to look at the girl, who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted in quiet cheers and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story immediately after the class had calmed down. I have to say, the way in which he told this story rendered horror junkies speechless and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it. I'll try to recount parts of the story, but don't hold me to it.
My friends and I set out on a road trip around the country after graduating from college. We took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, and set out to sightsee for the entire summer. Our travels took us from the Poconos in New Jersey, down the coasts of Florida, New Orleans, to California, and even up to Washington. From there, we went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and then back home to New York. Being adventurous college kids, we didn't bring a map. There were no time constraints, so we just sort of drove in the general direction that we wanted to go and eventually found a town to stay in or someplace that looked interesting. Now, after spending a week in Colorado, my friends and I traveled through miles and miles of corn, plains, and more corn. After a long drive and a short group chat, we decided to pool our extra cash and stay in a hotel for a night. We settled into a motel in some town that, I can't seem to remember the name of it. Well, one of my friends realized that our group was near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, we decided to get a quick refund from the motel and try to contact the friend's grandpa. We were unable to get a hold of his grandpa on the phone, but my friend was adamant that his grandparents would take us in and feed us without a moment hesitation. And with that, we had set out with an hour of sunlight, seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in.
In Kansas or Nebraska, wherever it may have been, there aren't a whole lot of natural markers that could guide lost travelers. Any directions given to someone who didn't live around the area basically amounted to, go a couple miles to the corn, take a right and go down the dirt road to the other corn. There should be some wheat on your right. So, as is the case in most scary stories, the group got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat, they drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes until they found themselves on a wooded road, and Mr. Mays' friend swore his grandparents lived off of it. Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. I wasn't entirely sure how true it was, because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanations of
the trees that almost tried to grab the car,
and
the red eyes of countless animals looking at us from the darkness.
Regardless, the typical horror tropes worked on most of the class. Everyone was terrified.
So our group drove on this dark road for about 15 minutes before we came to a clearing and a small building with lights on it and what seemed to be a silo. We figured that, at the very least, the people who lived there would be able to help us find where my friend's grandparents lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of the country fueled this theory. So anyway, we pulled the car up near the building. As we piled out of the car and looked the place over, we came to a bizarre conclusion. This appeared to be the kind of place where one would store a whole bunch of chickens, not a home. Still, the lights were on, so we figured, why not give it a try? We approached the building as a group, looking in the semi-open sliding door to find a big, empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime, yet we didn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of my buddies was convinced he'd seen someone as we pulled up. So we decided to go inside and see if there was an office or something where someone might still be working. Why else would they have this huge place lit up like this? There were no doors on the inside of this building. Again, it was just a giant empty hall. So our group roamed around the property and over towards the silo. We get closer and noticed a cellar door.
At this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the entire class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he hadn't seen many horror movies before that time, and he didn't think twice about approaching a creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary foreign place. He said that approaching that door was one of his biggest regrets. Mr. Mays let the whole class know he was going to tell as much as he could that he deemed appropriate.
Before I continue, I would like to say that I feel that you are mature enough to handle the rest of this story. However, if there are any who are squeamish, you're welcome to leave the class early.
Several students quietly gathered their things and walked out the door. A couple of them being stoners who just saw it as an opportunity to smoke behind the school before their next class. I didn't even give the announcement a second thought. Like I said, I was and am a sucker for this kind of stuff, and Mr. Mays was telling a story better than anything I had ever conjured up. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. After the class had thinned a bit, Mr. Mays continued with the story.
All right, let's continue. We opened the cellar door, releasing a smell, the most putrid thing my senses have ever experienced. The least of our concerns was finding the owners of the property. We were now set on finding the source of that smell. We went down the steps into the cellar, which was lit by single bulbs spaced sporadically along the ceiling of a long hallway. No one spoke. Things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, similar to the roofing on farms. The hallway itself was crooked and the ceilings constantly lowered and rose, like a tunnel that was hastily dug and then never touched up. There were sections where we had to crouch in order to pass. What bothered me the most was that the light bulbs continuously flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light and making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, I was certain that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I remember seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. When you're that focused on something, or if you are that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It can simply revolt, showing you things or people that aren't there.
He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat.
The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. My guess is that we were somewhere under the creepy forest we had driven through when we found a door, but I wasn't sure. Our group came upon a door after walking for what felt like a mile. It was simple and wooden, but it looked like it belonged outside of a suburban home. It had a nice design, seemed to be freshly painted red, and had a very nice knob and knocker on it. It was a door that belongs at the entrance to a nice house, not one that would be sitting in a dirt tunnel in the middle of nowhere. My friend walked towards the door, moving carefully because of the flashing light bulb and increasing uncertainty about the stability of the surrounding walls. He turned to us, noticing that we were nervous, and attempted to lighten the mood. I should probably knock first. So my friend grabbed the steel knocker and hit it against the door several times, mockingly, but quietly uttered, "Is anyone home?" We waited about 30 seconds before our tension broke. My friend next to the door shrugged his shoulders and started to walk back to the group. But as he did, the light bulb between us surged and exploded. All of us shielded our eyes and looked back to our lone friend by the door. As he lowered his hands, one of the metal sheets of the makeshift roof dropped. The edge of the sheet fell directly on his forehead, slicing it open and sending a wave of blood down my face. The impact knocked him out, and he fell back against the door, knocking it open in the process. We all rushed through the dim light to our friend, barely noticing the seemingly pitch black room that now lay before us. I was the first to make it to my friend's side. I lifted his head into my arms, took off my jacket and put it over his forehead to attempt to stop the bleeding. Once the group had calmed down, I noticed that my arm that had been bracing his head was soaking wet. I was confused, attempting to sort things out. But then one of my friends started talking. He said something along the lines of, "The lights, we have to go," when I finally noticed them. You know when you turn off a light and everything is almost pitch black, except for the light of the bulb dying out or cooling down? It was like that, but there were so many of them. At least 20 light bulbs had lit the room seconds ago, and now only looked like little stars in the darkness. That was definitely terrifying, but that wasn't the scariest thing. There was still a very dim light coming from the hallway behind them, and though it was weak, it lit the room up just enough to see the shape of tens of people standing less than 10 feet in front of us. My friend went to say something else, as one of the light bulbs to our right flickered to life.
Let me interrupt at this point to say that Mr. Mays was generally a playful guy. He had that tone of voice that basically makes you want to respond. He could say, "Let's go jump off a cliff, guys," and you would want to respond with, "All right, Mr. Mays, show us the way." That was a ridiculous statement, but it gets the point across. He was a charismatic guy. The whole story up to this point had been told like a campfire story. He had the voice inflections of someone attempting to be mysterious and scary, which worked, but was noticeable. At this point in his tale, I recall him changing completely. He was no longer attempting to spook anyone. I could tell this section of the story was difficult for him. Either he was a very good actor, or it was a really terrifying memory for him to relive.
The light bulb came to life and illuminated the group of people in front of me. In the dim light, I could see children, at least 20 of them in just the visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked to be tattered and torn, stained dark with something. Their hair was long. Every single one of them looked like they hadn't had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were almost completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them didn't appear to have seen a shower or nice bath in their entire life. The most terrifying thing was that none of the children were moving. They were all standing, staring, most of them only visible from the faint light reflecting off of their eyes. We were paralyzed with fear for several seconds. We snapped out of it when we heard what sounded like an animal in the distance yelping. It was like the sound of a dog crying multiplied by 10. We were hit with the chills, then a wave of adrenaline. Just as the children began to step forward, my friends grabbed the injured one and lifted him out of the room and into the hallway in an instant. It took me another second to move, and I had difficulty finding my bearings. I reached to my left in an attempt to find a wall to lean against, and ended up finding a handle, then pulled hard, never losing my vision on the children. I bolted for the door right as I noticed what I had grabbed onto. A shower head protruded from the cement wall, reaching maybe a foot into the room. There was something leaking from it, but it was too dim to tell what it was. I realized that it had been leaking onto me, but I didn't care. There were now children stammering towards us as an animal cried in the distance and our friend was seriously injured. As we left the room, we could make out several more shower heads on the wall near the single dim light bulb. This is why I call them the showers.
I was transfixed, sitting as far forward as my desk would allow, bracing for more.
I slammed the red door behind me and ran through that hallway faster than I have ever run before or since. I made it back to the car and we drove out there like a bat out of hell. So, when you're trick-or-treating tonight, make sure that you know exactly where you're headed and don't go out to any abandoned farmhouses. I mean, there aren't that many around here, but you're all smart kids. Except Jerry.
The class laughed, and the mood lightened as the bell rang for passing period. Mr. Mays turned the light on and thanked everyone for listening, reminding them about their paper due next week, and told us to have a safe and happy Halloween. Students all around me were abuzz with theories about the story they had just heard.
"I bet it was some sort of crazy Nazi hideout,"
said one girl.
"I think they were all ghost babies that were killed by a dog,"
said another. I couldn't theorize in the slightest. I was still caught up in the moment. The way that Mr. Mays had told that story, and the detail that he included, left me feeling like we didn't get the whole story. A couple days later, I stayed after class and asked him about how it really ended and what happened to his friend. He laughed and said that his friend was fine, and that it was honestly
probably due to some of the drugs that we were on at the time.
Mr. Mays winked at me as if to say,
"Don't tell anyone about the drugs bit, kid."
And I smiled and left. I lived in that town for another couple months, and then I was rapidly moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I twisted the story around and told it around campfires as I got older, and it was always a hit. But I always changed the ending, letting the friend die from loss of blood or just being dragged away by the children. It wasn't until college that I got a chance to talk to Mr. Mays again. I went to college in northern New York, not for any reasons associated with the story. College was a fun time for me. I continued being the same ham that I had always been. It wasn't until sometime around my junior year that I had ran into Mr. Mays at a bar that I frequented. Now initially, I couldn't be sure that the person I saw laying with his head buried in his arm at the bar was Mr. Mays. The only trait that grabbed my attention was the sweater he used to wear on his birthday during class. It simply read, "I'm the birthday boy." I told my group of friends to grab a table and that I would join them in just a second. Then I walked over to the man at the bar. "Mr. Mays?" The man took a second to look at my face before he smiled. He put a hand on my shoulder and said,
"Hey there, son, how you been?"
I could smell some strong whiskey on his breath, and his cheeks were flushed. The look in his eyes had told me that he was 3 sheets in the wind and probably had no idea who I was. "Mr. Mays, it's Jack. I was a student of yours for a couple of semesters about 6 or so years ago." His face changed a bit and a genuine look of recognition set in. He took a calmer tone, smiled, and said,
"How have you been, Jack?"
We talked for a solid 20 minutes. I told him what I had been doing for the last several years, and he told me. Apparently, he's been teaching at the same school doing the same old shtick, as he called it. I asked if everything was all right, and he said that they are good as they've ever been or will ever get. It took me a while to realize that I was an adult and I was having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had spoken to Mr. Mays previously, it had been a student-teacher relationship, but now I was just a guy having a drink with a friend at the bar. My friends eventually left and I continued to drink with Mr. Mays. He told me all about his divorce and his kids, things I never would have asked or cared about previously. But now, I cared. He was a real person to me, not just an idol anymore. This was a guy who had real problems, not the infallible teacher that I had once thought he was. It had been several hours before I brought up his story about the showers. I told him all about my history with urban legends and scary stories, and he just laughed. But when I mentioned the story he had told us years ago, he almost seemed uncomfortable. He finished his whiskey, signaled for another, and then turned to me and got very serious.
"Listen, Jack, I don't know why I keep telling the story year after year."
His words were slurred, or my hearing was messed up. We were both sufficiently blitzed at this point.
It was what my therapist told me to do when I was younger. I had to tell people it to come to grips with it or some shit.
He took a big swig of his drink. "Wait, your therapist?" Mr. Mays had laughed heartily and looked at me.
Of course, Jack. You think that something like that wouldn't fuck a person up?
I was confused, but smiled nonetheless. Things had gotten very strange. "But I mean, you said you and all of your friends were on drugs or something, right? No one was too terribly hurt. You were all okay, right?" He got almost cartoonish with his sadness in the next several seconds.
Of course we didn't, Jack. Why do you think I'm here right now?
I was puzzled, quickly filled with 1,000 questions that I wanted to ask him, but I let him carry on.
Tim he didn't make it, Jack. Fucking took him, they did. I don't even know. Cops told us we were just drunk, but he wandered off and he got taken by wildlife. He didn't know. He didn't see it, Jack.
I was absolutely stone-faced at this point. Mr. Mays was carrying along like I knew the actual story, but I didn't. His friend disappeared. I didn't know.
I'd wish they'd found the body, though. Then we could have shown them. That's a bad place, Jack. I don't know of anything else to say. It's a bad place.
He carried on for a couple minutes more about his friend and the fun that they had had before they went up on that trip, and I let him talk. It was only a few minutes later that his phone rang.
Hello, sweetheart. I'll be out in a second. I love you, baby.
The person on the other end of the phone had hung up, and Mr. Mays got up to leave.
Been nice seeing you, Jackie. You got a good head on your shoulders, boy. Make sure you use it.
He began to walk out the bar. Hey, Mr. Mays!
Yeah, Jack?
Where did you say all that showers business took place?
Where? Hell, didn't I mention it? Somewhere outside, Broken Bow, Nebraska. Fucking hell on earth, if you ask me.
Mr. Mays walked out of the bar after waving to me, running into a wall before eventually finding the door. That was the last time I would see him. I'd never be able to tell him what an impact he had on my life, or rather, the impact his story had on me. He'd never know about the trip that we took after graduation, almost mimicking the one he and his friends had made. He would never know that the things he saw in that place were real. Why? Well, he died about a month later. His liver had failed on him. It's alright though, because his family was with him in the hospital room. He got to die around the people that cared about him. And that is all I can ask for a man like that. I experienced that place too, several years later. That is where my story turns. The following is a story of how I came to find the showers, and why I will never, ever go anywhere near Nebraska ever again. I'll finish this story when I'm sober. The memory is clear enough.